Alright, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, prepare to be amazed. This patch comes with changes to your classes, so be ready. Let's sit down with the Barbarian. So let's see what Blizzard's philosophy is. Well, every single class has this in front of its philosophy setting right now. So I'm not going to read it every time, but here's what they're saying. They want to better support character builds that are based on specific damage types. And they're changing the damage types of a few runes. They had mentioned this before in a few blue posts. I had actually meant to report on it. I got busy, didn't happen. But they were talking about it, and I knew it was going to be coming soon. Didn't know if it was going to come in this patch, but 2.05 came out right from under me here, and it just, boom, here it is. Here's some changes. Now, these aren't going to be final, obviously. They're going to keep continuing to look at performance. As it stated here, it's an ongoing goal. Additional changes may be made in the future to any classes, which may make damage types an interesting consideration for character building. Alright, that being said, let's look at their specific philosophies for the Barbarian. They say that Rend is being changed to make the damage more consistent. Now, okay, this isn't just Rend. This is being mentioned here because it's for the Barbarian, but this is important, and I think you guys should know this because it affects all dot-bearing classes. Witch Doctors, basically. Witch Doctors, Barbarians in general. Any skill that is a dot has been modified. There's been some debate whether dots could crit or not. A lot of people were debating back and forth on it, and basically people found out exactly what happened is that apparently when it comes to dots, whether or not the ability crits is calculated on cast. So if I use Rend, the moment Rend hits an enemy, the calculation is done and the game says that was a critical strike. If that's the case, then every single tick on that Rend is a critical strike. Now you might think, hey, that's kind of cool. So maybe you get lucky, you get a critical strike, and it gets a whole bunch of damage. Well, you have to remember that if you Rend again, you overwrite the previous Rend, and what if you don't crit? You've just completely ruined your crit chance. You've completely ruined the dot. You've taken it off and you've replaced it with a standard dot that's not doing near as much damage as before. This is the same danger you have when, let's say, you activate a bunch of damage abilities at once, so you're trying to get that massive damage hit for one hit, and all of a sudden all those cooldowns fall off of you and you accidentally refresh the dot. That can happen, but at least that's in your control. Crits really aren't in your control. And this made this very difficult for dot-based skills, builds, and classes. Simply because you could never predict it. You really didn't know whether you crit or not, and you'd have to keep an eye on the numbers. If you didn't crit, you'd have to keep reapplying. It's really a nightmare to keep track of. Now, I was really hoping that Blizzard would eventually be able to fix this, because honestly, very honestly here, this has been an issue ongoing for Blizzard games like since time immemorial. When I was playing WoW, I was a warlock. You want to know what they had a problem with on dots? Crits and haste. Really. I don't know what it is about Blizzard and dots. The math just never seems to be able to be updated in real time. Maybe the only solutions they find are going to be far too complicated and will cause far too much of a degradation to performance. I don't know. I just know that this has been a problem for forever. And I was really surprised to see that this problem sneaked into Diablo 3. I guess I shouldn't have been. Okay, so yes, this has been a problem since forever. I was really hoping they would just eventually fix it. They didn't. They can't, apparently. Alright, I won't hold it against them, because honestly, the solution they've come up with isn't too bad. Dots are now going to, instead of being so unpredictable, they're going to take the difference between getting a crit and not getting a crit. And they're going to kind of average them together. So what that means is, kind of in a layman's terms here, because this isn't entirely accurate, but I think this is the best way to put this. If you look at your character's sheet DPS, now we all know that sheet DPS is a great judge of a general realm of power, but anyone that plays the game seriously and is seriously gearing their characters knows that sheet DPS is a lie. Sheet DPS is only going to get you so much because critical strikes, things like that, abilities with long cooldowns that hit really hard are going to be very different. You could have a 300,000 sheet DPS, and I've seen Crusader friends of mine who built really well for a specific ability, specifically bombardment with a one giant hit, getting crits for like 40 million. Okay, I mean, this is what happens. The sheet DPS just really is a general guide, and if you're using certain types of skills, it may not be the best guide. If you're going for slow attacks with high damage, the sheet DPS could lie to you. Maybe you want high damage per hit. They're usually going to probably go for higher crits and crit damage rather than attack speed. For certain classes, for example, may not like attack speed, like witch doctors. You know, attack speed can be great for witch doctors and certain skills, but a lot of witch doctor abilities pretty much like to hit hard. And so attack speed will increase your sheet DPS, but not really increase the DPS probably in the way you were expecting. So in this case, they're going to take that sheet DPS, essentially, and that is going to be kind of used as a general guide rule for where your dots are going to be. So it's going to just auto-calculate that and put it out as a general damage. So this means that dots now, with proof from Blizzard now, blue writing, dots cannot crit. They will not crit anymore. And the downside to that is that crits are on crit effects for skills, weapons, things like that, will no longer be affected by dots. So please keep that in mind when you're looking into building a dot build. Alright, now specifically for Barbarian, since I've talked a lot about that, finally they are buffing the least used Fury Spender. Seismic Slam. Seismic Slam? Really? Seismic? Wow. I find this odd because I personally really like Seismic Slam. It's got a good range to it, decent damage, it had some pretty good control abilities. I just like the feel of it. Aesthetically, I like Seismic Slam. Alright, so that's apparently the least used Fury Spender. Now, will there always be a least used skill? They recognize that. They feel that the aesthetic of Seismic Slam is very strong. Hear, hear. And they would love for more people to enjoy using it. To this end, they are trying to make the skill mechanically easier to use as well as directly buffing the damage. Okay, so that's the overall philosophy. And I like the idea about changing dots up, because honestly, I really think the dots needed to be somewhere else than where they were. Whether this is the best place they could be is up for debate, but I think this is better than before. Just because it's really terrible kinds of upkeep that you have to do to maintain how the crits work. So overall, really not much on philosophy other than they want to change Rend and Seismic Slam. Okay. I can see that their numbers are showing Seismic Slam are underperforming, or at least people aren't using it. So you know what? They want to buff it. Great. I'm using it. That's going to help me out. So let's start looking at the skills. Active skills. Frenzy. Alright, skill runes, sidearm. Damage type has been changed from physical to cold. Overpower. Skill rune crushing advance has been changed from physical to cold. So as you can see, a lot of these are going to be changes to elemental type to give more types of builds. This is especially important because they've noticed that fire has basically been the build to have and has been basically overperforming, and a lot of the best abilities, or at least so I've heard, I can't say for sure, were considered to be fire. So they are trying to get some of these other runes into other realms. Revenge, best served cold. Hey, guess what? Now cold. So a few more cold abilities there. Best served cold just makes sense, right? Really? You know? Best served cold? Oh, well. Alright, we've finally gotten down to Seismic Slam, so let's take a look at what they've done to it to meet their philosophy. Seismic Slam will now also hit enemies in a 10-yard wide, 10-yard long area in front of you, in addition to the existing cone. So I went and took a look at that because that kind of confused me a little. 10 yards is really not super huge, and what it seems to be is it seems to be kind of to make up for the fact that the cone starts fairly narrow, so you're still going to hit things pretty heavy in front of you. I'm not entirely sure on that change, to be honest with you. It seems a little odd, but it seems to be that they're trying to fit with that aesthetic of Seismic Slam hitting the ground really hard, so it should still hit the stuff in front of you pretty hard. They've also increased the base weapon damage for Seismic Slam from 550 to 620. Now, the only real issue I take with that change is that Seismic Slam and Ancient Spear, for me, have been kind of at odds. I've tried to make ranged barbarian builds, and I always came back to Seismic Slam. Ancient Spear can fly out a bit farther, but Seismic Slam hits a lot of a wider area and typically has a few more runes that seem to be a little more utility based, such as a knockback, a stun, things like that. Of course, granted, that's changed with this patch. But we can see now that the base damage of Seismic Slam is greater than Ancient Spear now, which just to me, again, is really odd, because when you look at the base level of the spear hits a very narrow area, whereas Seismic Slam hits a very wide area, and typically Seismic Slam is going to hit more enemies. That makes Seismic Slam something of an AoE, where the spear is not. Typically, AoEs do less damage than their single target brethren because they hit more monsters, and therefore will be doing more damage overall when you're hitting a lot more monsters. Now, granted, the Ancient Spear can hit a bunch of enemies in a line, but that makes it more specific and very driven to a singular point. So I'm not sure what I think about that. I think ultimately the spear can do more damage if you use the right passive and rune, but it still just kind of sometimes disturbs me to see that, because when I think a ranged build, I should have a ranged weapon where I'm throwing that spear out. And to be honest with you, I'm just not seeing where Ancient Spear is kind of fitting with the kit so much. There are some runes that are kind of nice, such as the ability to pull enemies in, like the old base functionality used to be. But as a general ranged ability, it doesn't seem to be holding up there. But apparently the spear is doing better than Seismic Slam, so who am I to judge, I guess? But that's my thoughts on that ability. Let's go ahead and move on to the patch notes. They altered the duration of the cast animation to be the same as most other Barbarian abilities. Yeah, it did feel a little bit quicker on that one. Removed the short knock-up. So Seismic Slam in general, for all of its runes, had this knock-up, unless you got a specific rune which changed it. There was one that turned it into a knockback. So that's no longer there. The skill is pretty much a pure damage ability now. Good news is, the skill will now ignore line of sight blockers, such as the Waller effects. Looking at the runes for Seismic Slam, Permafrost has had the weapon damage increase, of course, from 710 to 755. The slow duration was reduced, though, so they're bringing the damage up, lowering the utility just a little bit. Slow durations changed from 2 seconds to 1. Shattered Ground has had the weapon damage increase from 710 to 735, and they've changed the knockback to the knock up. So Shattered Ground was the rune that kind of more recently was changed to have that knockback effect. So if you want to keep it a distance, and this is what I liked about having Seismic Slam as a ranged ability if you're trying to play ranged. You can keep your distance, they get too close, you use Shattered Ground, they have that knockback. So the knock up has been removed from base functionality, but been added back in Shattered Ground, at the cost of the original knockback. Lastly, the skill rune Stagger has been redesigned, and it reduces the Fury cost from 30 to 22. This one doesn't exactly make much sense to me, because as the ability is called Stagger, the reason it was called Stagger is because that rune gave you an 80% chance to stun. It no longer does that anymore. So the name Stagger really doesn't make sense for it. The damage is still lightning, which was consistent with other stuns, but all it does is a Fury cost reduction. So I'm thinking, if anything, they might look at Stagger again later, and we might see another change there. Either the element changes, the design may change again, I don't know. But I'm feeling like something different is going to happen there. I mean, as a rune, that's not really a bad thing to have. A reduction to your Fury cost allows you to basically use that ability more often. But we are losing a pretty significant AoE stun in that regard. And it doesn't quite fit with the aesthetic of lightning. A lot of lightning builds now have some kind of stunning component. So I'm just wondering if the element there will ultimately change. All right, moving on, Warcry. Range has been increased from 50 to 100 yards. So they've doubled that. You can get Warcry out to people a little off beyond your screen now. Whirlwind Skill Rune Hurricane has been changed from physical to cold. So I'm seeing a lot of physical damage abilities being changed to cold for the Barbarian. So we may see some cold builds go out now for the Barbarian. Wrath of the Berserker Skill Rune Ariat's Wall. Changed from physical to fire this time. So another fire rune added there. Striding Giant for Wrath of the Berserker has been redesigned. So Wrath of the Berserker gives you what? It gives you critical hit chance, it gives you attack speed, dodge chance, and movement speed. Striding Giant used to increase the dodge chance up to 80%. So you had 80% more dodge chance while you were using Striding Giant. As a Barbarian, you typically don't have a lot of dodge. Now, 80% increase from even what little we had was still pretty good, but it didn't quite fit a Barbarian. So now it's been adjusted to reduce your damage by 50%. So now not only are you doing a bunch more damage, but you're taking half damage. So really, it's like a big cooldown, ignore pain. Looking at the passives for the Barbarian, Inspiring Presence has had its range increase from 50 to 100 yards. This makes sense since Warcry and in general, the shouts in general, it would appear, have had their range increased to that. So Inspiring Presence as a passive had just pretty much had its yardage increased to match what the abilities were actually doing. The passive Relentless will now also have a buff when it's active. Now that's the one that when you're below 35% life, all skills cost 75% less fury, and your damage taken is reduced by 50% as well. So now you'll see a little icon so you know for sure that it is active. The damage reduction provided will also be reflected in your toughness if you happen to be looking at that. Alright, let's look at the new child on the block, and the one that's been receiving a lot of attention. We're talking about the Crusader. Yes. The Crusader has brought his crusade to Diablo 3 and Reaper of Souls, and he has been getting a lot of attention. Not all of it good. The Crusader has been in this very interesting location where he's been fairly tough, especially when built properly, but a lot of Crusaders will probably tell you that their damage output just really isn't quite there. Now, a good Crusader, a Crusader that's built really well, can put out a ton of damage, but it usually requires certain things to line up. Basically, the stars have to line up. You have to have your cooldowns ready, or you have to kind of game it. Like a Crusader, a good friend of mine, Archer Zero, building a Crusader. He did it a really interesting way, and it works out really well. He can pretty much one-shot elite packs in some of the mid to high-range torment levels. He basically focused on physical damage, and, of course, getting bombardment, plus the bombardment skills. The combination of the physical and bombardment and the use of the bombardment rune that basically made it one giant hit made it so that even though his sheet DPS is still under, like, I think it was still under 500,000. It might have been at 500,000. At least last time I talked to him about it. Even though his sheet DPS wasn't super high, he was critting for, I believe the numbers he was giving me was 40 million. 30 to 40 million damage, I think, and it pretty much one-shotting almost any elite pack he came across, and that's what he would save it for. Now the downside is that it had a fairly lengthy cooldown, so he's sitting there trying to kill white mobs, and it's taking him forever because all of his other skills just weren't keeping up. So Crusaders, while they can do well, they really seem to need a group, because they, especially with that build, he would kill the elites, the rest of us would kill everything else, and so it kind of created an interesting synergy, but I don't think that's really the best or most fun playstyle for a class like that. So I really think that the changes we're about to see and we're about to discuss were pretty much needed for a Crusader. They've really buffed Crusaders again, alright, and some of these things have changed. Now there are some things here that I'm kind of sad to see go, so let's go ahead and move on. Alright, let's start with the philosophy that Blizzard is giving us. Crusaders should be the toughest class in the game, and currently they are not. They have increased the 15% damage reduction to 30%, to match that of monks and barbarians, so they are finally a true melee class in the eyes of damage reduction. In addition, they are removing the movement speed penalty on Heavenly Strength, while also changing Fervor to be a very strong passive for Crusaders who want to play with a one-handed weapon. Together, these changes should solidify the Crusader fantasy of a powerful tank wielding a giant shield. And I think they will. When we get to the specifics, you'll probably see this. Alright, the next line is the specifics about changing element types again, so we've already gone over that. Alright, Akarat's champion has been redesigned. Many of the runes were lackluster, while Rally was both too strong, but also promoted a style of play that consisted primarily of mashing buttons mindlessly. They've redesigned Rally and buffed the skills of all other runes. Overall builds that use certain skills such as Judgment Resolved could do solid damage, although somewhat inconsistent. But if you did not take specific skills or have access to specific legendary items, the damage would fall behind. They're nerfing Judgment Resolved significantly, and they mean that. Significant is very true. A change this large is never easy, and it was a mistake that they should have caught, is what they're saying. Basically, they're saying they let this go for too long. They should have seen this coming, and they should have fixed it earlier. And to that, I agree. I really do, because Resolved, I'll go ahead and talk about Resolved here really quick. That is the ability on Judgment that increases the chance of a critical strike to happen on the monsters that are judged by 80%. And that affected the entire party as well. So you'd sit there, you judge the enemies, and you have now an 80% crit chance. And why would you need to build crit chance when you have that? 80% crit chance. You wouldn't really need more than that. So what you would focus on would be crit damage. And you wouldn't need tri or quad factors or whatever, because you didn't need the crit chance anymore. Not only that, but you put that on top of an ability with a high cooldown, you're going to hit really hard. I mean, once again, I talk about the very high cooldown build of a Crusader that's doing a crap ton of damage, but couldn't kill anything outside of having those cooldowns. Alright, continuing on with Blizzard's statements. To keep Crusader damage competitive, they are buffing most of the Crusader's damage abilities across the board. A few skills have come down slightly in damage. The vast majority are being increased by a large margin. Fists of the Heavens and Blessed Shields both fill a similar role of being a ranged multi-target skill. In order to provide better differentiation between the two, they are adjusting Fists of the Heavens to be better at damaging single targets, with the area damage component being a peripheral bonus. To this end, the damage of the primary strike of Fist of the Heavens has been increased, while the damage of the secondary has been decreased. Finally, they've done significant redesign to the Crusader's passive abilities. They feel that there is an overall lack of interesting passive choices on a Crusader. Rather than trying to simply change numbers, they've tried to provide interesting and compelling choices. So we should see less number changes on those passives and more actual tweaks to gameplay. So, and again, some good, some bad. So first off, the Crusader getting the 30% less damage from all sources. Great. I always thought it was weird that they didn't get anything. They're a hybrid class. I thought to myself, why don't they just put it in the middle? Why not give them half of what the Barbarians and Monks have? And they did that. And unfortunately, they felt that's still not enough, because a lot of Crusaders do like to get up in the thick of things, and they do kind of need that damage reduction. So they have been granted that at last. Alright, let's look at Accurate's Champion. That is the first ability on the list. So the skill, it used to provide a 25% attack speed bonus and 100% increased wrath regeneration for 20 seconds. Not bad. Attack speed bonus can be quite nice, but it's not as good as having an overall damage increase. So what it does now is just that. It increases damage by 35%, so you don't attack faster, but you hit harder. The Wrath regeneration has been changed from a 100% increased Wrath regeneration to a flat 5 Wrath per second, which I think is a pretty good change, because what it does is it allows you to gain Wrath between combat engagements while the Accurate's Champion is active. Really, ideally, you want to be an Accurate's Champion the entire time during combat, but if you find yourself in between enemies or something like that, you're still getting Wrath, and having a steady flow like that can be quite nice. Especially means that you're still getting Wrath even when you're spending it. You are also immune to crowd control effects when you're under the effects of Accurate's Champion, which honestly I think was kind of odd that it didn't do that before, just because of the nature of it, since it kind of gave you that giant Avatar of War thing going on. The skill runes have been changed here. We've got Embodiment of Power. Embodiment of Power now increases the Wrath generation to 10 per second, so you're doubling the Wrath regeneration with that rune. Firestarter has been changed that now dealing damage will burn enemies with the power of Accurate for 460% weapon damage as fire over 3 seconds. So all your attacks while you're in that form will now cause a burning effect. Skill rune Hasteful. Also redesigned, you will gain a 15% attack speed while Accurate's Champion is active. I mean, just kind of looking at these, some of these are pretty nice. I mean, going back to Embodiment of Power real quick, since I'm kind of looking at how these changes have been affected here. Embodiment of Power used to be that enemies within 7 yards of you had a chance to become frozen in fear. So that, you know, you're losing a little bit of that, but you are gaining the additional Wrath, which means you are going to be able to use your abilities more often. So you're losing, it's more than just a numbers change here. You're actually losing one mechanic for another, and it's not bad, I don't think. I think 10 Wrath per second can be pretty significant for being able to put out a lot of abilities should you need to. Going to Firestarter now, which basically allows your attacks to just cause burning damage over time. That's pretty nice. I mean, you consider the old ability was where you spent 20 wrath and then you explode for 100% weapon damage. So first of all, the weapon damage has been dramatically increased, and now your attacks, which you're trying to hit with, should do the burning damage rather than trying to get up close and hit enemies with that. So for example, Firestarter is a build or a rune I would never have used if I was trying to build a ranged Crusader, because you spend the wrath and you explode. If you're at ranged, you're not going to hit anything. Firestarter can now be used for that kind of build now. Hasteful has been changed as well. It basically returns the attack speed that was removed from Accurate's Champion. So you look at what happened to Seismic Slam. It lost its knockup, but it got it back in a rune. Accurate's Champion loses its attack speed, gets it back in a rune. And it's still fitting to the theme. Hasteful used to provide 30% increased movement speed. Now, rather than a movement speed, you're getting attack speed. So it's still somewhat similar to what the rune used to provide. Skill Rune Prophet will now return you to full health the first time you take fatal damage. So, I didn't mention this, but it is very important to the change to Accurate's Champion here. Accurate's Champion on all runes would do that. You used to be able to pop that, and if you took fatal damage, you came back to life. I mean, that made it a very useful skill across all the runes, but obviously it meant that you would just kind of pick the one rune that was going to be, massive for you, which in this case was Rally before. Specifically, Rally would, every time you deal damage, there'd be a 50% chance to reduce the cooldown of your skills. So obviously you would want that because you'd want to constantly be getting your cooldowns down. And that makes sense. So now you're going to come back to life and you're going to get your cooldowns reduced. Why not use it? Now the fatal damage resurrection has been taken off the base skill. And that kind of makes sense because when you look at the other classes, a lot of classes have resurrection effects. The Crusader is the first one, I think, that's had it as an active base ability. But now it's still a rune, so you haven't completely lost it. If you like that effect, if Accurate's Champion is what you used as a get-out-of-jail-free card, you still have it. You just have to change your rune. Alright, I did mention Rally. Rally has, of course, been changed. Rally now reduces the remaining cooldown of other abilities by 12 seconds when Accurate's Champion is activated. So rather than a constant cooldown reduction as you're doing damage, it is a flat, hey, you pop it, 12 seconds have been removed from all of your timers. Makes it kind of interesting because it means activating it can be a meaningful choice when you're using that rune. Are your abilities about to come off cooldown anyway? Do you want to use it now? Do you want to wait? So that can be kind of an interesting choice. Overall, the changes to Accurate's Champion I think I kind of like here. The Wrath regeneration can be quite nice rather than additional Wrath from your Wrath generator abilities. Because then, if I have to run away from combat and not attack, I'm still getting something out of it. The raw damage increase I think is much better than the attack speed thing. The attack speed has been given back to us from other passes and runes, you'll see. So I think that change is also a very good idea. The immune to crowd control effects, obviously, I think that's a good idea. Now, the loss of the fatal damage thing is definitely something that will be missed. I haven't gotten that far with my Crusaders, but it is something that I was very happy to get when I finally got it. So, I will miss that. But I think overall, Accurate's Champion may be in maybe a better place, I think, than it was before. Alright, Blessed Hammer. Weapon damage increased from 200% to 320%. Burning Wrath, of course, getting an increase, 150 to 330. Icebound Hammer. Weapon damage... Oh, this is nice. Icebound Hammer for Blessed Hammer has been increased as well, but massively. The explosion weapon damage is increased from 75% to 380. Massive. Thunderstruck has also been buffed from 40 to 60. So overall, Blessed Hammer, not really getting much changes, just getting an overall damage buff. If we look at Blessed Shield, we see kind of the same thing. Mostly damage increases. It is going from 340 to 430 as a base damage. Combust, the weapon damage has been increased from 270 to 310, and the radius has been increased 8 to 10 yards. Divine Aegis damage type has been changed from holy to physical, so we've seen a lot of physical skills being changed, and it was something I was going to talk about. I kind of like physical being there still as a school, because there's still the ability to get physical increasing affixes, and it would be nice to see some people, to maybe see some people experiment with that, try something that's purely physical. Now that I'm actually seeing something changing from holy to physical, it's nice to see they are still considering physical. I thought they were moving everything away from it for a while there, so I'll hold back on that that debate there until I kind of see more of what they're doing with these. Shattering Throw for Blessed Shield, I know that's a popular one. The Fragment Weapon Damage. What's weird here is that I'm seeing it saying damage decrease from 333 to 170, yet I'm looking at the tooltip on the old boards here, and it's saying that the old weapon damage was 50%. That must be wrong. So if I'm reading this patch note right, then, since I haven't been able to just double check and confirm it here just yet, you're going to see a decrease in the damage that Shattering Throw does. And I think they've done that to make it so that the other runes are more appealing. And I can kind of see that. I mean, just looking at the damage from Combust and all that, it's still going to do a decent area of effect damage. But as I mentioned before, most area of effect skills have reduced damage because they hit more targets. That one, since I can't really confirm it, my Crusader's not really high enough, I could definitely look at it in the game. Game does seem to reflect that change. I am seeing 170 in the game, so yeah. I mean, it does look like that is going down. So I'm not entirely surprised. I mean, I've seen it in action. I know that Shattering Throw is the preferred rune for Crusaders. You know, I mean, honestly, this happens. If one rune or one ability becomes way too useful, typically what they've been doing is buffing other skills around it. I've noticed that's been kind of what they've been doing lately. They used to just plain nerf, but now they're doing a mix of the two, which is good. You should never fully nerf, I feel, and you should never fully buff, because if you fully buff, then things become trivial. If you fully nerf, then you just never feel powerful. So I'll be interested to see what people think about that change to Shattering Throw, especially since I know a lot of people use it. Are you happy to see that change? Are you maybe interested in trying different versions of Blessed Shield, or maybe even different skills in general? Alright, looking at Bombardment, they've made a slight mechanic change to this. Rather than a random variance, there should be a static 0.35 second delay between bombardment assaults, and it should make the damage more consistent and reliable. Other than that, there's really been no damage changes. There's just been some changes to the elements. Bombardment Annihilate has been changed from physical to fire. Minefield has been changed from physical to fire as well. And Targeted has been changed from physical to holy. Also, the proc coefficient was apparently lower than intended, so you should see more procs happening from Bombardment. The ability Condemn, seeing some changes as well to elements. Reciprocate changed from holy to fire. Shattering Explosion changed from holy to physical. And that also has had its proc coefficient increased because it was lower than intended. Only a single change to Consecration. This is specifically to the rune that does damage, Shattered Ground. Weapon damage has been increased from 95% to 155%, so we're seeing, again, more damage increases. Also, going in line with that philosophy, damage from the rune will now trigger procs. Wow, I said that completely wrong. So apparently, Consecration was not triggering abilities that on hit, so now it will. Falling Sword, seeing of course buffs like everything else. Weapon damage increased on a base level from 1100 to 1700. And the knockback effect has been replaced with a small knock up instead. So Falling Sword can still be used to interrupt. I actually think it's better to have a knock up on this because I like to combine Falling Sword with Condemn. I think it makes a pretty nice 1-2 punch, and the knockback could knock enemies out of that. Changes to the runes. Skill Rune Flurry. Weapon damage, the sword weapon damage on that was 60%, now has been massively increased to 230, and the damage type is going from physical to holy. Part the Clouds, damage type being increased from 165 to 605, not a small change there at all. Damage type on Rapid Descent changed from physical to lightning. Rise Brothers changed from 143 to 280, and Superheated going from the burning damage changed from 200 to 310 per second. Also, once again, proc coefficient was lower than intended. Also, beyond that, apparently there was an issue where the impact was always dealing physical damage regardless of what rune you did, so it wouldn't get the +2 element skills you were getting before. So if you ever wondered why Falling Sword didn't seem to do a lot of damage even after you buffed your elements, that would be why. Alright, so they talked about Fist of the Heavens in their philosophy, and now we're at that as a patch note here. The explosion weapon damage on Fist of the Heavens has been increased from 340 to 545. The bolt damage has been reduced from 340 to 255. So it used to be an even amount, right? The explosion would hit for 340, then all of the bolts would hit for 340 as well. So if you were lucky enough, and let's say you just got 2 hits, I mean, of course, it could be more because there's multiple bolts, but you were looking at about, let's say, 680 damage in total, if we just consider 1 bolt. So if we're just considering that, this is still a buff. So you've got the 545, but you've also got the 255. So that's 800 weapon damage. So overall, Fist of the Heavens is going to be hitting for more damage in general. And I think I like that they've done this because honestly, looking at Fist of the Heavens, that very first hit is the one that looks powerful. And I really think that I was actually surprised when the secondary damage was as strong as the first. It made it a very spammable ability at a big group. And so now it's nice to see that it's more single target oriented. Looking at changes to the runes, Divine Well, the bolt weapon damage has been reduced from 80% to 40%. So again, decreasing the peripheral damage from the skill. Fissure weapon damage has been increased from 400 to 410 over 5 seconds. The arc weapon damage, again, peripheral, changed from 185 to 135. Looking at Heaven's Tempest, the weapon damage, again, reduced 150 to 100 per second. And they've changed the damage type on that one from lightning to fire. The final rune, Retribution here, the weapon damage, there's a lot of changes on this one. So the pierce weapon damage has been reduced from 350 to 270. The explosion has been increased from 150 to 435, and the bolt weapon damage reduced from 350 to 185. So again, anything that's area of effect has been pretty much hit with a pretty big nerf, while the single target stuff has been, or smaller radius stuff has been increased. They've also removed the minimum cast range on Retribution and changed its damage type from lightning to holy. All right, since I've been reading a lot of damage numbers here, I'm just going to kind of blow through some of these that are just damage increases. Heaven's Fury has been pretty much greatly increased. Looking at the base level, we're looking at from 1,260 has been increased to 1,710. Every single rune underneath it has been increased in damage similarly. The only other change that might be interesting is that Thou Shall Not Pass has had its damage changed from Holy to Lightning. Apparently, Heaven's Fury also had a lower than intended proc chance. So Crusaders apparently had a lot of issues with proc chances. So not only are you seeing more damage, but you should see more procs on weapons and abilities that you have. Keeping in line with weapon damages going up, the 1 offensive Iron Skin rune, Explosive Skin, has had its damage increase from 1,050 to 1,400. They talked about the Judgment nerf. Here it is, specifically the rune Resolve, the critical hit chance bonus reduced from 80% to 20%. So a very significant slash on that one. It still seems like it would be useful, but it's obviously not going to be all end all that it was before. Justice, the long-range generator skill, has had its damage increased, not nearly as much as some of the other skills. It's only gone from 240 to 245. But they have changed a few of the runes here, just a tiny bit. Skill rune Burst, explosion weapon damage on that was increased from 30 to 60%, so that actually got doubled. Skill rune Crack, where the hammer would hit and split into 2. The additional hammer chance has been increased from 80% to 100%. So now you will always have the weapon split. And the damage has, of course, been increased. Hammer Pursuit, damage increase, of course. Damage type changed from holy to physical. And Sword of Justice, damage type has been changed from holy to physical. Now it has seen a slight change as well in its stacks. It used to do 5 stacks of 3% movement speed. It now does 3 stacks of 5% movement speed. Basic math will tell you that those ultimately end up to be the same thing, 3 times 5. The total bonus is 15%, but what will happen now is you'll get, with a single stack, more of a bonus, and the high end of that can be reached very quickly, with only 3 hits rather than 5. So that's basically a general buff to quality of life and just general speed. Every single law that the Crusader has had its cooldown reduced by 15 seconds, so all laws are now 30 seconds. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to laws, this is where one of the changes for the Crusader comes in that I don't exactly like. The skill rune, Answered Prayer, has been redesigned. Answered Prayer will now, with each enemy killed while the law is empowered, increases its duration by 1 second to a maximum of 10 seconds. So if we look at Law of Valor, When you activate it at a base level, it grants you attack speed for 5 seconds. So what that means is if at maximum stacks, you're going to have 15 seconds of increased attack speed. And that's not bad considering that all the cooldowns have been reduced to 30 seconds. That means that under the right conditions, you can have a boost to your attack speed at about 50% efficiency. So half the time you could have this. Unfortunately, it relies on kills, so that won't happen for bosses, but that still can be quite nice. Now here's the downside. If you look at Answered Prayer as it was prior to this patch, this was the law that when you activate it, gave you a 20% chance to drop Nephalem Glory Orbs. I'm really saddened to see this go, because I have seen Crusaders running with the Answered Prayer rune and using it in group settings. That is a massive boon. You pretty much had 100% uptime on level 3 Nephalem Glory. You always had 3 stacks of Glory, and that improved your movement speed, and it allowed you to do extra damage. And this was a group-wide thing. Your entire group had this. And so that really made Crusaders very useful in a group setting. I'm really sad to see this go because I feel without it, Nephalem orbs are in general far too infrequent. It is very difficult to ever get 3 orbs under natural circumstances without something like this. And let alone keep that buff. Now, maybe they felt that that was too strong. Maybe they want the orb damage and the orb bonus to be more interesting to have it. And I can kind of see that because we've seen that philosophy change. Like we look at Archon for the wizard. Archon was changed because of its ability to constantly keep itself up. You could have Archon up almost all the time, and that made Archon kind of unspecial. You would basically be in Archon all the time, so why would you ever want to be out of it? Being out of it felt like it was a penalty, rather than being in it feeling like a bonus. So for Laws of Valor, I can kind of see them taking the same philosophy. They didn't mention this. This is the weird thing. They did not mention this at all in the philosophy. So kind of seeing, I can only speculate this is why they're doing this change. Maybe they want it because 3 globes of Nephalem Glory just shouldn't be something that's constantly up. It should be something that you get and it feels cool to have rather than something that sucks not to have. Now that being the case, what I would really like to see is the general drop chance of Nephalem Glory Orbs to be increased, because I just feel like they don't happen often enough. Now I do know there's at least one legendary item out there that will increase the chances for these globes to drop, but it's under very specific circumstances. The one I found was apparently on blind, and the character I got it on had no blind ability, so that kind of sucked. So honestly, I'm really hoping that they consider increasing the drop chance of the glory. But yeah, that's happened with the laws. So there's my rant on laws for Crusaders. Alright, Phalanx is getting a buff as well, of course. Base damage going from 380 to 490. Another buff there, though, is that enemies can now be hit by multiple Phalanx avatars. So apparently an enemy could only be hit by one avatar at a time, meaning you were only going to do 380 damage to one enemy. Now you can do 490 and possibly hit with more than one, so you could even double that. All the runes so far are looking like they've been buffed. The only other changes that are interesting, it looks like, is the skill rune Stampede and Shield Bearers both have had the distance reduced that enemies are knocked back on those. Few bug fixes to provoke here, ones that I'm not entirely sure how they fit into things, but one bug fix is they fixed an issue that allowed provoke to proc other powers, and a skill rune charged up. A bug fix on that, the chance to deal damage is now properly based on the damaging power's proc coefficient. Alright, the Generator Punish. Weapon damage increased from 2.7 to 3.35 as a base. The skill rune Fury has been changed from physical to lightning. The skill rune Retaliate has been changed from physical to holy, and the weapon damage dealt when you block has been increased from 94% to 140. And the skill rune Roar has been increased as well. The explosion damage going from 40 to 75%. There was also apparently an issue that prevented the base attack from dealing fire damage. So now you should see more damage on Punish with fire belts. Shield Bash getting something of a change mechanically, and I think I like what they've done with this. Shield Bash should now more reliably hit targets that are close to you. And if Shield Bash causes the player to charge an enemy, that enemy will now be rooted for 1 second on cast. So I think what that's supposed to do is prevent enemies like that. I've noticed that certain skeletons had this jumping move where if I tried to charge them, they'd jump and they'd get out of the way. I think that's supposed to stop them from being able to do that. Now, typically it used to be that the skill one-on-one was the one that immobilized people. Now it's kind of a base, but one-on-one used to give you 3 seconds. This only gives you 1 second. They've also added something called smart targeting here. And I'm of two minds on this one. If you target an area that's more than 10 yards away from you and you click on nothing, the closest target to your click point within 10 yards will be charged. So what this means is that you can be a little more lax on your targeting for the shield. You will charge the nearest enemy to where your cursor was. Now again, it has the caveats of it has to be more than 10 yards away from you, and the enemy has to be within 10 yards of where you clicked. Now, the downside here is that if you're really good at targeting and manipulating the skill, that means that it's going to auto-target for you maybe when you didn't want it to. All right, changes here. The skill rune Crumble has had its damage type changed from Holy to Fire. Skill rune One-on-One has been changed from Holy to Lightning. And the 3-second Immobilize that I mentioned earlier has been removed, but it's been replaced with a 1.5-second stun. So that's actually a little better, I feel. Even though the duration is removed in half, you still have the root on it still when it's being cast. And a stun is typically better than a root anyway because it interrupts enemy attacks. The rune Pound seeing a pretty significant increase in damage from 740 to 1,200. Changed from Holy to Physical, and it should now always hit the chosen target. Shattered Shield. The fragment weapon damage has been increased as well, 380 to 740, so a pretty significant buff there. And Shield Cross, the weapon damage increased there, and the damage type changed from Holy to Physical. The Generator Slash seeing an improvement from 190 base to 230. The skill rune Carve, which increases the AoE of the ability, should now more reliably hit targets next to the Crusader. And the skill rune Zeal should increase the number of stacks from 5 to 10. So Zeal, if you're not aware, is the skill that gains 1% increased attack speed for every enemy hit. This happens for 3 seconds, and it used to stack up to 5. It now stacks up to 10, which means you can get a 10% increased attack speed. You may have noticed a theme here. The Crusader is going to have a lot of attack speed increasing abilities, especially when we get to the passives. You can get a one-hand attack speed going pretty quick, it looks like. All right, Steed Charge. You guys remember the nerf for Steed Charge in the last patch, that where they took it from 2 seconds to 1.5 seconds, and then they reduced the one rune from 3 to 2? Yeah, that's been reverted. Steed Charge is back to where it used to be now. Why they bothered, I'm not really sure. A 1/2 second also felt really weird for removing. Like a second, you can kind of understand. 1/2 second is just odd. All right, so Steed Charge should now start its cooldown immediately when used as well. So you've got 2 seconds that it's active, those 2 seconds will be part of the cooldown as well. So you don't wait 2 seconds, then the cooldown starts. So effectively, when you think about it, that actually reduces the cooldown of the skill by 2 seconds. Effectively, not really, you know what I mean. Steed Charge will now go through and destroy destructible objects and doors. So if you're charging through, trying to get through a door, it'll just automatically break it down for you. And anything destructible will basically be destroyed for you, which is kind of nice, so it can be useful for clearing out some areas. The rune Drawn Quarter has been changed from Physical to Holy. And the rune Endurance, as I said again, has been increased back from the 2 seconds back up to 3. All right, we've got an interesting change here to sweep attack, specifically the blazing sweep. But let's talk about sweep attack space first. Damage increased, not by much, from 440 to 480. It is an AoE ability, so I can kind of understand that. Now, the width of the cone has been increased from 120 to 180 degrees. That means everything in front of you within a half circle is going to get hit. Supposedly that matches the visual, but there you go. Now, let's talk about blazing sweep. The weapon damage on Blazing Sweep has actually been reduced. You would think that kind of odd, because everything else is getting increased. Blazing Sweep is probably one of your strongest sweep attack abilities. So sweep attack with Blazing Sweep would catch the enemy on fire and do additional 170 weapon damage. Now it's only 120. But the damage over time from Blazing Sweep will now stack with itself. So that was the one downside to Blazing Sweep. If you used it multiple times, there was really no point. You were doing the extra damage of sweep, but you were overriding the dot over and over again, meaning the dot really never increased in power. It was a nice increase in damage, but it was never really great. So they reduced the main damage in order to allow it to stack with itself. So now you can sit there, put a whole bunch of fire stacks on an enemy and watch them burn in righteous hellfire. Gathering Sweep damage type has been changed from physical to holy as well. Whew! Alright, ladies and gentlemen, we're getting through here. We're now at the passives for the Crusader. I do apologize that this one is apparently going to be a long one. Alright, so you remember me talking about the Nephalem orbs there just a moment ago, and how I'm sad to see them go from the Crusader's repertoire. Unfortunately, they are doing the same thing with the passive, Nephalem Majesty. So Nephalem Majesty used to increase the duration of those glory orbs by 30 seconds. Not a lot when you think about it, but especially with the loss of the law that would generate those orbs, you would think that that would be really welcome to have again. Well, I can kind of see why they decided this wasn't a really great passive, because I can see a lot of people not wanting to run with it. I think the glory orbs were kind of an underrated thing, but once you've run with it and having them all the time, you kind of notice how powerful they really were. But they decided to remove that. So Nephalem, those glory orbs, unfortunately, they're just now a mechanic that's there. So they're just there. There's no class that interacts with them, it would appear, anymore. So what have they done? They've removed Nephalem Majesty. They've replaced it with a skill called Fanaticism. Fanaticism increases the attack speed of Justice, Punish, Slash, and Smite. So all of your generators by 15%. Remember I was just talking about having some attack speed? There you go. You get Zeal on there and you get Fanaticism. That's another 15% increase in attack speed. Speaking of attack speed, Fervor has been redesigned. Fervor used to give you 10% attack speed for 3 seconds when an enemy died within 15 yards. Now 15 yards is not a lot, so that means you had to be up close in order to get this. It also required an enemy to die, which means it was pretty much useless against either single targets, bosses, elites, or things like that, unless you happen to kill someone around them, and then only lasted for a few seconds. Well, now it's a lot better. Fervor is basically the one-handed equivalent of Heavenly Strength. While wielding a one-handed weapon, your attack speed is increased by 15%. On top of that, all of your cooldowns are reduced by 15%. I honestly thought that the attack speed by 15% would have been enough. Fervor, in general, when you look at the old one, was a 10% increase, so this was already a 5% increase in attack speed. But now it's 15% and cooldown reduction. Now it does have the added caveat of having to have one-handed weapons. It cannot be a two-handed weapon anymore. But it is basically the polar opposite of using Heavenly Strength. So you now have a choice. Do you want two-handed weapons and use Heavenly Strength, or do you want Fervor? It's definitely an interesting choice, because one-handed weapons by design are meant for you to attack more often, just not as hard. So you can see that reflected in the cooldown reductions. Finery, getting a slight change. Finery will gain you 1.5% of your strength for every gem socketed into your gear. This is kind of more of a scaling change. It used to be a flat number. You would gain strength for every gem socketed, and it was just a flat number. Now it's a percentage. So the more strength you have, the more you get. Speaking of Heavenly Strength there a moment ago, Heavenly Strength, in case you might not have caught on when I was mentioning it earlier, Heavenly Strength has had the movement speed penalty removed. So that was the one downside to having Heavenly Strength. Sure, you could use a two-handed weapon as a one-hander, but you were going to move slower. Now, it removed the top-end movement speed, 15% of that. So what that meant is if you had anything less than 10%, I think, movement speed, you still got that. You never lost movement speed. You just couldn't go as high as other characters. And really, that's just not great, because you're going to be moving slower than your allies. You're going to kind of miss out on things. And also, survivability can really depend on being able to move out of things. So really, what was kind of cool to have that two-handed weapon. It just really could end up putting you in bad situations. Alright, the passive Holy Cause is kind of an interesting passive. It's one I thought was maybe just a bit too specific. Holy Cause used to say that the amount of holy damage dealt by your weapons was increased by 10%. And of course, whenever you dealt holy damage, you gained 1% of your total life. Okay, that's all well and good. That's great, but, finding a holy weapon may not be the easiest thing. What they've done is they've made it so that the damage amount, the 10% increase, is no longer affected by being holy. Now, apparently, the heal part of it still is. So if you want to be healed, you still have to have a holy weapon, but you still at least can use the passive without a holy weapon to gain a damage increase. Redesign of Indestructible has been put in place. Previously, Indestructible would make it so that you gained more defenses the lower on life you were. For every 3% missing, you gain 1% armor, which was kind of nice, but definitely led to this thing where the more protections you get, the lower on health you are. But that pretty much meant that if you were high on health and got hit by a particularly nasty attack, you still might die just because you wouldn't have gotten the armor kicking in soon enough. They decided to change that. They've turned it into your basic life restore mechanic that other classes have as passives. When you receive fatal damage, you instead become immune to damage and gain 35% increased damage, and you also gain life per kill. The recorded amount here appears to be about 82,000 at level 70. And this happens for 5 seconds. So it's a little bit different from other resurrection mechanics we've seen where you would just get the life back, say 35% when you die and you're back and you're good as rain. This is pretty interesting to me because it basically gives you complete immunity for 5 seconds. You're invincible for 5 seconds. During those 5 seconds, you've got additional damage to just go ahead and do whatever you need to do right then and there. And whatever you kill gives you a good chunk of life back. So you could potentially restore your life back up to full real easy on that. Now this effect does occur once every 60 seconds, so it does have the longer cooldown, much like many of those do. Insurmountable change. I'm not sure about this change. Insurmountable I thought was kind of interesting, that when you're surrounded by enemies you would gain a block amount. Now I mistakenly thought previously that it was a block chance. It's actually block amount. But that can be quite useful considering that you're reducing your overall damage when you're getting swarmed by smaller enemies. Now unfortunately or fortunately, depending upon how you want to look at this, it depends on your playstyle I suppose, Insurmountable has been changed so that blocking an attack will now generate Wrath. Right, there's been some changes to Iron Maiden, once again kind of evening things out, because Iron Maiden used to provide a flat thorns damage for your character when you put it on. I mean, it literally just gave you thorns. It was like, here, have a free piece of thorns gear, practically. But that amount, a lot of people really didn't think was great. I mean, it was good if you didn't have any, and it was good for lower levels, but... And mistakenly, what happened in the last patch, or prior to the last patch, the thorns damage was being increased by difficulty level. And people were like, hey, this is great. But Blizzard said, no, that wasn't intended, and they nerfed it. Or brought it back to what it should be, I suppose, is the right phrasing of that. But now, they've decided to change it so that it is a 50% increase in thorns damage. And that just really just makes a lot more sense. To just have a nice flat... or not even flat, a nice percentage increase of your thorns damage. So if you're building a thorn set, the more thorns you have, the better this passive is for you. Towering Shield. This one was kind of interesting. It took the mechanics that Demon Hunters had for both their awareness and for, was it Steady Aim? The one where you get critical... no, it's not Steady Aim. The one where you basically got critical chance every second until you crit. So Towering Shield used to do just that. For block chance, you would gain 2.5% block chance every second until you blocked. And then when you blocked, it reset. Okay, pretty straightforward, but it's a mechanic that's been kind of mimicked several times in the Demon Hunter tree, so it really wasn't a mechanic all its own. It was still very useful, obviously. But now, I honestly think it is much better. Towering Shield will now instead increase the damage of Blessed Shield, Punish, and Shield Bash. So you can get a nice amount of damage for your shield abilities with this. And it increases them by 20%. It also reduces the cooldown of Shield Glare by 30%. That, again, is fantastic. So you've got these shield abilities that are going to do plenty of damage for you. And then Shield Glare, which is a blinding mechanic that already has a pretty short cooldown. And you can reduce that cooldown further. Now, imagine, you could combine that with Fervor, and that's giving you increased attack speed, but also additional cooldown. You could be using your Shield Glare quite a bit, and Shield Glare's got a rune that increases the damage you do. There are some pretty nice synergies happening here, it would seem. So overall, I'm liking the changes to Tower Shield, or Towering Shield. All right, last on the list for Crusaders, Vigilant is getting a buff up to Barbarian levels. Vigilant gives you increased life regeneration and it also reduced non-physical damage, but it used to only be 5%, so I kind of call it the discount Barbarian passive. The life regeneration was really not that great. It was okay, I thought, and the non-physical damage was far weaker than what Barbarians got, but now it's going from 5% up to 20%. So Crusaders now have the same for survivability. Not only is the passive, they go from 15% damage reduction up to 30, and now they're getting the non-physical damage reduction as well. So Crusaders had better damn well be tanky after this patch. Alright, Demon Hunters, your patch notes are relatively short compared to the others. Demon Hunters actually didn't get a lot of changes to skill elements. In fact, they didn't even get the little philosophy blurb about it. But they did get a minor change there. Now, they did say, though, that Demon Hunter survivability is lower than what they would like. While the Demon Hunter is not as tough as other classes, it can be frustrated if it's taken to the extreme. The change to the awareness passive is a basically first step. They'll be keeping an eye on this and making additional changes as needed in the future. The Marauder set bonuses are attractive, but often the pets would get in each other's way, or sentries would not use their spenders often enough. To help improve the set's functionality, companions have received collision box revisions, and the rate at which sentries use hatred spenders has been increased. So that is very specific about a set for the Demon Hunters, which is kind of interesting, and it is, I think, a very useful set. Even if you're not wanting to build for that, I think it can be very useful, and it's nice to see that they've actually considered that there were challenges with that. So the first change to Companion is that Companion collision boxes should now be more closely match the size of the creature. It should allow them to more effectively surround enemies. This is very specific to the Marauder set because it allows you to have all your pets out, and they were basically stumbling over each other. This can also be useful for the armor piece that gives you 3 wolves rather than 1, although to a lesser extreme, simply because 3 wolves is not taking up a lot of retail space. Now you could technically, though, have the 3 wolves and all of the pets from the Marauder set, which means having them updated as well can be nice. Grenade. I want to just take a quick moment here to talk about Grenade. Prior to Reaper of Souls, I hated Grenade. It didn't always seem to hit where it should have. It bounced off and past enemies. It just really seemed very hard to use. I want to honestly sit here and take a moment to say I want to thank Blizzard for what they did to Grenade. I honestly think Grenade right now is in a much better spot than it was. In fact, I've actually started using it as a primary in certain builds, and I think it's much better. It actually is viable to me. But apparently they wanted to improve it even further. So here's what they've said. They will now more reliably explode when an enemy is near to the thrown grenade. The explosion radius on grenades in general has been increased from 5 to 6 yards. The collision radius of the projectile has been significantly increased, and they should now explode closer to your click location if it did not explode prior to reaching it. The max range has also been increased. It goes up from 45 to 75 yards, so you can start throwing those grenades really far. They used to blow up real early for some enemies, so that is nice to see. Honestly, I'm very happy to see them do that. I already liked grenades where they were. Hell, I like Seismic Slam. 2 abilities that I actually like getting buffs. Who knew? Alright, this is great. Hungering Arrow, Skill Rune, Devouring Arrow has been changed from physical to cold. I cannot tell you how much I love this change, by the way. I mentioned in previous patch notes about the changes to Wind Force. Wind Force was providing a knockback, and that knockback was not counting towards the gauntlets, the stone gauntlets that increase damage when enemies get knocked back. That's been buffed, and that is something I use. I use that combo. I also use Devouring Arrow with a quiver that increases the number of it increases the piercing chance by 70%. So Devouring Arrow is constantly piercing. So Devouring Arrow already does a good amount of damage with that build. Now it's going to do even more because I built for cold damage. So I have to thank Blizzard. They are buffing me. Sorry, small anecdotal stuff there about these patch notes that I really like. As a matter of fact, I think I'm going to put out a kind of a build update, just so you guys know. I won't talk about this for too much longer here, I promise. I'll probably put out an update as to how I've built my Demon Hunter, because I kind of like it. It's not the build I was going for, it's the build I ended up with, and yet I still kind of like it. Alright, moving on. Passive changes to Awareness. Awareness was kind of an interesting passive to add in Reaper. You had Sharpshooter before, which gave you critical hit chance every second that reset when you crit in Sharpshooter. And that was pretty cool, and so they decided to make a defensive version of that in Awareness where you gain dodge chance every second. And is reset when you dodge. And they kind of decided to change that out. And I'm not sure what I think about this. I can kind of understand it. They've basically changed it so instead of getting that, your armor is now increased by 30% of your dexterity. This feels like a very monk-type talent. I'm pretty sure the monks actually have that talent. So that's very weird to me. It's a toughness increase, that much is certain, but if you played right as a demon hunter, Awareness was fantastic, and it was one of my favorites for keeping myself alive, because you might sit there, you might dodge a few things, but what if a big hit got by and you got hit by it? With Awareness, it probably was going to miss. I can kind of see why it might be an issue, though, because if you just keep moving around, ultimately you can make it so you don't get hit, but I don't know. This is honestly one change I don't think I care for. Again, I'm happy that it's a mitigation change. That can be nice, but I think from what it was, I don't think I like it. I'll be interested to hear your comments or your feedback in the comment section below about that. Demon Hunters, what do you think? I've already seen some charged comments about this. I see some people really not liking that, and I really have to say I think I do agree with them. Alright, Monks, it's your turn. So, Monks were very disappointed when the last patch came out and all these other classes got all sorts of buffs and things like that, and Monks were pretty much left out in the cold. So, what's happened? Monks, well, they've got the standard blurb about changing damage types, but they also said they want to give Monks more options for spending their spirit. The damage on Wave of Light is being increased to encourage its use as an alternative to existing popular spirit spenders. Which is good. I really didn't dislike Wave of Light too much, although I admit it is fairly costly. I was able to find some uses for it in some builds I made. But let's start with at the top of the list here. Crippling Wave. A Skill Rune Rising Tide has had its damage changed from physical to holy. Moving on to Deadly Reach. Skill Rune Keen Eye changed from physical to fire. Scattered Blows having a bug fixed. Fix an issue preventing the first and second hits from dealing lightning damage. So apparently only the third hit was doing lightning damage. And Strike from Beyond changed from physical to cold. Fists of Thunder. Skill Rune Bounding Light changed from lightning to holy. The Skill Rune Quickening. Damage type changed from lightning to physical. And Lightning Flash has been removed. So Lightning Flash was the rune that gave you a 17% chance to dodge for 3 seconds after each hit. So basically it was one of those generators that allowed you to be fairly defensive, but dodge is really not a great defensive mechanic, to be honest with you. I mean, sure, it helps. Not getting hit is great, but compared to armor, strength, resistances, really didn't quite measure up. So I'm really not sure if a lot of people were using that rune. So seeing it go is not really too sad. It has been replaced with, I think, a far better alternative. It's been replaced with this rune called Wind Blast, which replaces Lightning Flash completely, and it does cold damage rather than lightning. It is every third hit will freeze enemies for 1 second. So when you get that third hit out there, you've got a freeze. So you've got yourself a nice little root stun there. I think that's very useful. Not only that, but it gives you a little bit of cold damage. Mantra of Conviction apparently had a bug that was causing it to provide less bonus damage than intended, so now monks should see a general damage increase just by that bug fix alone. Sweeping Wind, Inner Storm, damage changed from physical to holy. Alright, getting on the Wave of Light, here's what they've done. Base damage, impact damage increased from 473 to 605. Runes affixed to that have also been increased. Explosive Light has been increased, and Explosive Light has been changed from holy to fire. Pillar of the Ancients has seen a redesign. I'm glad on this one. I saw Pillar of Ancients for the first time, and I thought to myself, I did not like it. It basically popped up, did damage, waited a couple seconds, did damage again. Kind of hard to use that way. So it's been changed. It should now deal 635% weapon damage as lightning upon its summoning. It is then followed by 785% weapon damage as lightning over 3. I said lightning over 3, not lightning after 3. So it's basically summoning a pillar that's going to do lightning in an area of effect around you. that seems like a pretty nice change to the ability of Pillar of the Ancients, and I really need to try that out. I like the fact that we now have some more interesting lightning skills. I actually had a lightning build going for a while using a legendary sword that made enemies lightning rods. I've now gone to a build that's more around fire. It's nice to see that we've got some more things here. We have more cold abilities. Monks really were shafted when it came to skills. I looked at skill generators, and a lot of the generators did not have different elements. If you had specific elements you were trying to build around, you were stuck. There was only, I think, 1 or 2 cold generators, and one of them was, I believe, was it Sweeping Wind? No. And one of them was Crippling Wave. And I don't like Crippling Wave except for only 1 rune on it. So now we're getting more. We're getting more of these. And we're getting a lot more elements. I like that. And again, I want to hear what you guys have to say about that, because I really think it's great that monks are finally getting some elemental damages here to try and make some different builds. I don't think it's perfect. I think there's probably more they could do, but I have to play with it before I can say that for sure. All right, moving on, let's look at the rest of the skill runes. Wall of Light. The impact weapon damage was increased on that one, and it was changed from holy to physical. And lastly, the Wave of Light rune Blinding Light has been removed. Blinding Light was the rune that allowed your critical hits to stun the enemies for 4.5 seconds. Now, while it says it's been removed, the truth of the matter is the skill has pretty much just been replaced and changed with a different damage type. Blinding Light's been changed to Numbing Light. It's been changed to cold damage, and it's the same exact mechanic. Critical hits, rather than stunning, are going to freeze the enemy for 4.5 seconds. All right, last on the list is Way of the 100 Fists, and really this was just a bunch of changes to elements. Blazing Fist was changed from physical to fire, which really seems like that should have happened to begin with. Oh well. Hands of Lightning changed from physical to lightning. Really? Again, something that should have happened. Spirited Salvo changed from physical to holy. So once again, fire damage type, a lightning damage type, and another holy damage type. So you have options. You get elemental damage. You can build around that now. Again, maybe not the best options, but that's what the comment sections are for below. And of course the Blizzard forums, if you want to try and argue that with Blizzard. Feel free. Feel free. Honestly, it looks like they're taking the feedback and they're taking it in stride. Alright, we are moving on to the Witch Doctor. Same blurb about elemental damage types. They are changing the way the fetish sycophants work. Previously, they triggered while casting. This caused it to create twice as many fetishes with certain skills, such as fire bats, which trigger on-cast effects at double the normal rate. It also created fetishes even when there was no target available. I'm sure we all know about that, where you've got the rune that makes it so it doesn't have a channel cost. You just sit there and you summon them. They want to preserve the existing fetish builds while allowing fetish sycophants to be combined with all skills in the Witch Doctor's arsenal. Fetish sycophants will now work with all skills, rather than only specific physical skills. And it triggers on hit, rather than on cast. Will this mean you can no longer summon fetishes by simply casting at nothing? You will now get more fetishes if you're casting against a large group of enemies. In the case of spells other than fire bats, you will generally get more fetishes than before. In the case of fire bats, you will probably get less fetishes than before against anywhere from 1 to 3 enemies, and you should see more when you're facing groups of 5 or more. So there's kind of a bell curve on that one with fire bats. It's going to be less in the beginning, it'll even out, and then there'll be more as you fight more monsters. Haunt and Locust Swarm are being changed. Alright, so this goes back to when I talked about dots being changed. Haunt and Locust Swarm have been changed so that their damage is basically evened out. It takes the difference between critical and non-critical hit, and they've evened it out and averaged it. And lastly, they say the Witch Doctor sometimes had trouble keeping up in a party situation. At the same time, they feel that the clash should feel unique. So to this end, they redesigned Fierce Loyalty to improve the Witch Doctor's mobility in a uniquely Witch Doctor way. We'll see what you guys think about that when we get to it. All right, starting out, active skills. Corpse Spiders seeing some changes to physical school or to elemental schools. Leaping Spiders change from physical to poison. Medusa Spiders change from physical to cold. Fire Bats, getting a slight little buff here. The initial mana cost has been changed from 225 to 150, so it's now less mana to cast Fire Bats, and a decent amount of mana reduction on that as well. Damage on Fire Bats has been increased for several runes, just not at a base level. So Dire Bats was increased 300 to 495, Hungry Bats was increased 350 to 635. The only other change is to Vampire Bats, which still maintains the no channel cost, but the mana cost reduction that I just talked about, the change from 225 to 150, is reverted. So for Vampire Bats, the damage cost for the initial is 225 again. So what that means is that Vampire Bats essentially is going to act like it always has compared to last patch. It's just that all other runes are basically getting a damage or a mana cost reduction to start off. Alright, the Gargantuan is getting some changes to elements. Humongoid is being changed from physical to cold. Bruiser changed from physical to fire. Wrathful Protector getting a slight change here. The knockback effect has been replaced with a small knockup. That seems to be a constant theme within this patch. A lot of knockbacks being replaced with knockups. Also, a bug fix was entered into the system that all Gargantuan attacks were not benefiting properly from +% elemental damage gear. So pet builds, you should be happy to hear that. Your elemental damage gear will now count for more for your pets. This is including the dogs. They apparently had the same bug. So you should see more damage across the board if you had a pet build that was using specific elements. Haunt has had its jump distance increased to 70 yards, so Haunt should be a lot more useful against groups that are a bit more spread out. And of course it has been given the dot damage change. Alright, let's talk about Angry Chicken, shall we? For hacks. Alright, so a couple changes to hacks. These are pretty nice changes. Angry Chicken, I used to call that the most useless skill. And, you know, I was kind of talked out of it, and I understand how it can be useful, especially with the speed that it has. A couple things have been added to it that kind of make it even more useful. There's been a knockback change. Again, knockback change to knock up. I think that's less useful, but Angry Chicken now allows you to walk through enemies while transformed. So you now are able to go through enemies. That means Angry Chicken on Hex can be used as a secondary escape if you don't want to, say, use Spirit Walk, or maybe you have Spirit Walk, it's on cooldown. The Toad of Hugeness for Hex has had some nice changes. The damage significantly increased. So Toad of Hugeness is another skill I did not like at all. It goes from 24% weapon damage to 580, so that's really nice to see. The damage is very significant now. At least it's useful. It just really didn't feel useful before, and that's nice to see. Now, unfortunately, my beef with Toad of Hugeness wasn't just in the damage department. So while this change is nice, I probably won't change my opinion of the skill. Those of you that use it, though, will probably be very happy to hear this change. My problem with it was it was inconsistent. It couldn't really, I don't know, maybe they've changed it. I have to test it again, but it used to not work on elites and things like that. So I'll look at it again when I get a chance. But it also had a damage type change from physical to poison, and since Toad of Hugeness was considered a dot, it has been given the dot changes as well. Mechanic changes and buffs to Horrify. So this is on a global level here because it's all runes have been affected here. The radius on Horrify increased to 18 from 12. The cooldown reduced from 16 to 12. And the duration has been reduced from 4 to 13. So you can cast it more often, it just doesn't happen as long. It no longer fears enemies. So Horrify, while a really nice defensive rune, you'd cast it and every enemy around you would start running and scattering. Now, rather than scattering, Horrify will lock them in place. They'll sit there and they'll be mobilized in fear. Now, you might not think that's a great change, but the thing is that certain builds require you to be kind of close to the enemy. And this allows you to use something like a Fire Bats build. I was tinkering around on one of my videos with the Witch Doctor where I had Horrify and I had the bats, and it wasn't quite working out because I would use Horrify when they got too overwhelming, and it would prevent me from doing damage. Now I could Horrify them, they'll stay in place, I could do my damage, run if I need to. The downside to this is that yes, if you needed to use Horrify to escape and you were hoping on them running away from you while you run in the opposite direction, you're not going to get that effect anymore. However, the skill rune Phobia still has the fear effect on it. So Phobia will still allow that fear to happen if you need it. So there is a rune for you. And that's what I like about this patch so far is a lot of things they're taking away. They're generally adding back on some kind of rune. Alright, the only change to Locust Swarm is that it's getting the new dot damage, so let's move on. Piranha's Skill Rune Bogadile. Damage increase from 840 to 1100, and change from poison to physical. Spirit Walk. Here's a buff for you. I like this one. Spirit Walk will now allow you to walk through obstacles created by wallers. So, Spirit Walk was a great way to get out of things like that. You could run through enemies. You only had to worry about the spiritual body being there. Now you can actually run through walls, or at least waller walls. So you really, if you don't like waller, you want to have Spirit Walk on your bar. All right, skill rune for Wall of Zombies, offensive line. The maximum cast range has been increased from 24 to 28. That's pretty minor. In addition to that, we have Unrelenting Grip, which was changed from physical to cold. Zombie dog lovers, you might want to know that your damage has basically been increased by 2.5 times. You're getting a damage increase on the bite on zombie dogs from 12% to 30%. And keep in mind the bug fix I mentioned before about Gargantuan does count for the zombie dog. So you are getting plus elemental damage gear on your zombie dogs now. Alright, passive skills. Moving on to the Fetish Sycophants. Alright, now procs on hit rather than on cast, as they mentioned in the philosophy changed. It will be affected by proc coefficients. In order to make up for this, the chance to summon has been increased from 5% to 10%. And as I said, with other skills, you should probably see more Sycophants. I liked Sycophants in general, and I only really took it off my bar if I wasn't using one of the spells that they said would summon them. And it's nice to see that the chance is increased. So I'll have to play around with that. I think that's probably going to be an overall nice change and will promote more build diversity. Alright, Fierce Loyalty. They talked about this. I'm not sure what I think about this. Fierce Loyalty, let's talk about what it currently does. On the previous patch, would give your pets 100% of your thorns and life regeneration gear. This meant that you could build a Thorns build as a Witch Doctor and let your pets do a lot of the damage through your Thorns. Not only that, but it increased the survivability of your pets by a decent amount. I mean, they're getting your life regeneration. Now, granted, there are other ways to keep your pets alive. I believe there's a rune that allows them to get or at least an item that allows you to get 100% of life on hit for your pets. So there are ways to keep your pets alive, but that was a fairly decent tanky thing if you notice that your pets were dying too much, or again, maybe you wanted a Thorns build. So the downside here is Witch Doctors, you really have lost a strong item from your Thorns build, unless you were building Thorns and not putting it on pets, which I'm not sure why you would do that. So what have they done? Well, here's the good news. It allows you to have an additional zombie dog. You now have 3 zombie dog passives in the Witch Doctor tree. You can now have, in total, 6 zombie dogs. If you want to play a summoner, you may consider it. Now, the other thing, and the reason why they talked about Witch Doctors having a hard time keeping up, is that Fierce Loyalty will now also, while you have a zombie dog, gargantuan, or fetish following you, and you are not in combat, your movement speed is increased by 30%. So Fierce Loyalty breaks the movement speed cap for Witch Doctors, as long as they're not in combat. That's interesting. I mean, it really means that Witch Doctors are going to be able to zoom around the battlefield if they need to. I am really not sure. I mean, I really kind of hate to see a build there that could have been for Thorns go away, but at the same time, I like having summons, and I kind of like the fact that I can have another zombie dog using a different passive, and I can have some movement speed. That's really not bad. But I'm not so sure if that's the ability I would... I don't know. I'm kind of mixed on that. Fierce Loyalty is never a skill or a passive I ever really used. But I could see the benefit in it. Alright, 2 more changes for the Witch Doctor. Spirit Vessel now allows you to go through obstacles created by Waller, so that's pretty much just a modification of the Spirit Walk, as after all, Spirit Walk is going to have that change, the passive needs to have it too. And then lastly, Zombie Handler. So we just talked about having more zombie dogs. Zombie Handler, the major change here is it still gives 20% additional health to your pets, but it also gives 20% additional health to you, the Witch Doctor. So they've made it so Zombie Handler will buff you and increase your survivability. Whew, ladies and gentlemen, I got to tell you, this has been a long batch of patch notes because it's honestly, there's been a lot to talk about beyond just the patch notes. There's been kind of little things about philosophy changes and things like that that I really just kind of wanted to talk with you guys in general. And I suppose you could just think of this as the patch notes version of Diablo Digest, although I probably won't put it up as Diablo Digest. Also, as I'm recording right now, I've spent over 2 hours talking. My throat is a little hoarse. You have to forgive me. I will probably split this up into 2 videos, one for general patch notes, one for characters. Alright, enough of my griping because we're on the last class and you guys probably want to hear this. Wizards, I'm sure you guys want to know what your changes are. So don't let me keep you waiting. Let's go ahead and go on. Philosophy, once again, damage changes. We've got that. Alright, one major change that came here that they want to talk about in philosophy. Wormhole is by far the most common rune choice on teleport. While they like the functionality and frequency at which it allows you to cast teleport, they don't like the frustration it sometimes produces. Players often left clicking wildly, feeling punished for misclicks, or increased frustration if you find yourself up against an obstacle that wastes your second and third teleport. To improve the experience, they are reducing the cooldown on teleport to 11 seconds and changing Wormhole to only give 1 additional cast, but increasing the window of time you have to use your second teleport to 3 seconds. This affords the same number of teleport casts overall as before, while allowing you to be more thoughtful and deliberate about how you use your second teleport. With the base cooldown on teleport coming down to 11 seconds, all runes should now be more appealing. While the effect on some runes has been reduced, this should be more than made up for by the reduced cooldown in all cases. Alright, so that one's important there when we get to teleport. You're going to want to, because that's really true. I wanted to talk about that, but they pretty much give exactly what I was going to say there. Alright, let's look at Archon. If you paid attention to the last patch notes, you may have noticed that Archon got a bunch of new casting animations. Pretty much, this is exactly what I expected to happen. If you looked at some of those animations, some of them obviously had lightning and cold effects on them. So what I didn't understand is why they still all did arcane damage. If you're sitting there shooting a beam of ice, it was still arcane damage. So finally, all the damage changes are coming in. Archon is basically going to match the visuals that we have now. Arcane Destruction has been renamed to Combustion. And Combustion is basically a change from arcane to fire. The explosion that you cast will also deal fire damage. Basically all of your abilities. All the abilities are converted to fire damage for the Archon. Pure Power has had its damage changed from arcane to lightning, and of course all abilities to do lightning damage. And the skill rune Slow Time has been changed from arcane to cold. Keep in mind too that the set that gives you all the abilities of all Archon runes will use the highest percentage of skill damage that you have on your character. If the highest is fire, it will cast fire. If the highest is cold, you will cast cold. So it's a smart system, so you don't have to worry about losing your elemental damages when you're using that set. Alright, Hydra, Blazing Hydra. There's a bug fix that properly scales with attack speed. This directly relates to the gloves, Tasker, and Theo, which was mentioned earlier. So you can now build attack speed on your wizard. If you like your Hydra, you may want to consider that. Magic Weapon, Force Weapon, Knockback effect has been removed. That's the only change. I'm not sure why they decided to do that. I'm noticing a lot of knockbacks getting removed. And I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that, especially since that affects those Stone Gauntlets, bracers that increase the damage that you do when enemies get knocked back. So I don't really know about that one. That seems odd, and they don't put any kind of philosophy change or why they did that. Alright, Meteor, the skill Molten Impact has had its radius increase, or its area increased from 12 to 20. So close to double. Very nice impact trace there. I'm sure people that use Meteor would be happy to see that, as I know, depending upon the enemies you're trying to hit, sometimes it can be hard to hit enemies with that ability. Bug fix from Slow Time, which was causing Slow Time to sometimes persist after the caster died or expired. And lastly, the changes to teleport. So really not a lot here for Wizards, honestly. I think Wizards got most of their changes on the last one. But here, let's go ahead and talk about the teleport changes, because that was very specifically mentioned in the Philosophy. All cooldowns have been changed. They are no longer 16 seconds, they're 11 seconds. That's 5 seconds off of your cooldown. So you need to consider that when you look at these nerfs. Because I've already seen people complaining about the nerfs, but I don't think they're taking into account that you can cast this more often now. You're looking at almost a 30% reduction in cooldown. 30%. And some of these nerfs are far less than 30%. Alright, so let's look at Safe Passage. The damage reduction, it used to be 27, it's now 25. Again, cooldown reduction. You can have it more often. Wormhole, delay before the cooldown begins is increased from 1 to 3 seconds. And the maximum number of allowed teleports reduced from 3 to 2. So they already talked about that very specifically. Skill Rune, Reversal, now also reduces the remaining cooldown to 1 second if you use teleport to return to your original location. That's pretty nice. So you can use Reversal, you can teleport out, use Reversal, wait a second, and you've got it back. That's pretty nice. I actually think that makes Reversal far more interesting in my mind. Because it means you have you teleport and you realize, oh, I shouldn't have been here, you need to go back, and then you've got it again. That's nice. Alright, Skill Rune, Fracture. The decoys that you spawn have been reduced from lasting for 8 seconds to 6 seconds. A 2-second reduction on that, which is a 25% nerf, but when you can cast it 33% more often, as you can see, that's honestly probably going to be more helpful than you might realize. Lastly, Calamity. The weapon damage increased from 252 to 175. And the stun duration has been reduced from 1.5 to 1 second. So yeah, a little bit of nerfing there, but I really think that the reduced cooldown time is going to make up on some of those. Overall, not seeing a lot of differences here on the Wizard. Seeing some nice changes Witch Doctor side. Still, I'm like on the fence on some of the changes with the zombie dogs there. Monks, nice to see monks finally getting some love. Honestly, when I was trying to build for my monk, I was very disappointed in the amount of options I had. I was trying to build, I think at one point, cold damage. I was not happy with some of the choices I had. And I'm glad to see we have more, but I think we still may have some ways to go, because I'm looking at this list here, and some of these are nice, but I think they may need to change some other things. We'll have to see what happens. Demon Hunters didn't get a lot here. Massive changes to the Crusader, obviously, getting the bulk of these changes for this patch, and a massive damage increase and survivability increase. Really, Crusaders have been buffed like 2 times now, massively in 2 different patches. It's really hard to believe that they came out so broken when you think about it. But people have still managed to enjoy them, and I did think that they were fairly usable if you played them right. But that was the downside. You kind of had to have specific builds for them. And then, of course, the Barbarian getting some changes to some skill types. Is it going enough to change Fire from being the primary build for Barbarians? I don't know. Time will have to tell. I think the biggest change here, though, is for dots. Barbarians, Witch Doctors, and the like. I'm hoping to see a general damage increase from that. I really am. At the very least, damage should be more consistent, so I'm glad of that change. So overall, how do I feel about this patch? Well, I think overall I am happy about this patch. Specifically since I have been rather liking playing my Crusader. I haven't gotten him up to max level yet, but I enjoy him, and it's nice to see those changes. The changes to legendary drops, when it comes to bounty modes and all that, definitely, I like to see that, and I like to see that Kadala is going to be a bit more useful. Although I still am kind of saddened to see that legendary items were not, or sorry, torment-only items were not added to Hereditary Crashes. Alright. I think that's going to do it here. I've talked for several hours, even though you're probably not going to hear most of it because there have been takes, retakes, and edits. But hopefully it's been worth it. So far, every time I've gone out on a limb and made these patch notes, overviews, and discussions, you, ladies and gentlemen, have enjoyed them. So I will continue to push my throat to its boundaries. Pardon. I will make that self-sacrifice for you, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you for coming along on this journey through patch notes, and I will see you next time.